Hiya, I'm Sally and welcome to my channel Vaudeville Manor. This is my channel dedicated to art making and tarot. A little bit of a strange combination maybe, but the two have become entwined. I have discovered tarot in the last couple of years and I am now embarking on designing my own tarot deck. This video I am going to share with you the tarot decks that have come into my life, give you an overview, and at the end I shall tell you which one is my favourite, so stay tuned. Now I should say that I think pretty much all of my decks, maybe except for the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, have either animals, fairy tales or some kind of whimsical nature to them. I don't know why, they're just the they're just the themes that I seem to be drawn to. So if you like decks with animals or fairy tales in them, then definitely stick around and see which ones I have chosen so far. Now at some stage I plan to do individual deck reviews, but for the purpose of this tarot deck haul I am going to focus on a couple of things. So who it's designed by, the publisher, the type of book and box that you get, why I chose the deck, and some pros and some cons for each of the decks. So I am going to try and do these in the order that I got them. I am going to kick off with the first deck that I bought, which was Tarot of Pagan cats. Yes, of course, love cats, so it had to be a cat deck. This is a deck published by Lo Scarabo and it has been created by Magdalena Messner and the artwork is by Lola Eragi. I hope I've pronounced that right. This is in a tuck box. I believe most of their decks come in tuck boxes, and you get a little white book with this deck which comes in a few different languages as well. It's a black and white book, very simple. When I decided that I was going to buy a tarot deck, I realised that I wanted to get a cat deck, and at the time, I think this was back in like 2020, yeah, it was the end of 2020. So it was the only deck, the only cat deck that really caught my attention at the time. I have since discovered plenty of other cat decks, which I will probably get at some stage. And what I'd quite like to do is do a comparison video of different cat decks, because I know cat decks are popular. And also I'm designing my own deck which has cats in it. So bit of research for me, and just kind of interesting how people have used cats. Obviously they're connected with magic and quite mysterious beings, which is quite appropriate for the world of tarot, so watch this space for that one. At the time when I was looking, this deck had really nice positive reviews, and I really like the artwork. There's quite a lot of detail that has gone into each of the cards, and actually the more that I've worked with it, and since learning a lot more about the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, I've realised that it is very true to the original artwork in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, and I'd quite like to do a comparison video to compare the two, because it is actually quite interesting. I didn't realise how similar they were, so watch this space for that one. Now I found when doing a reading with this deck, they're really quite gentle readings that you, or advice that you would expect to get from a friend if you wanted to find out about a certain situation. Really, if you've ever had a cat cuddle, that's what these readings are like. They're quite playful, they're not too they don't really call you out in a way that some of the other decks do. It's just sort of gentle, friendly advice, and sort of quite reassuring as well. So I really like the deck for that reason. And if you've ever had a cat come up and sit on your lap, it's that kind of thing. Now the pros of this deck, as I said, it's very close to the original meanings of the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. So if you're a big fan of Rider-Waite-Smith and you're looking for a cat deck, then I would definitely recommend this deck. The other thing I like about this deck, particularly the version I've got, is that the images go right to the edge. I do believe that there's another version of this where there is a border. Cons of this deck is the fact that it comes in a tuck box. This got battered really quickly, like within a couple of months of me having it. I did drop it a few times, but really you can see all the cardboard has started to peel here. This bit came off, so I've actually had to sellotape it on, which is a real shame, and it's actually put me off getting any more Los Scarabo decks. There were a few that I was quite interested in, but I just can't be bothered with this, and I'm not somebody, I don't really like having the cards in bags. I know people quite like that to protect them, but I quite like them in the boxes, just because when they're in bags they don't really sit on the shelf very well. They're little things, so that's my only comment. Other than that, it is a beautiful deck. The artwork is really detailed, and if you like cats, I think you will be charmed by this deck. Now, the next deck that I added to my collection is the Enchanted Forest Tarot. The Enchanted Forest Tarot by Lunier Weatherstone, illustrated by Mary La Allwood. So this is published by Llewellyn, and it comes in a rigid magnetic box. So magnetic. And it has a beautiful full colour booklet. Quite a nice size. As I said, most of my decks have animals or fairy tales, and this deck certainly delivers on both of those. In the description, it talks about how there's a lot of fear about what happens if you go into the woodland alone, and this deck certainly encourages you to take that risk and take that journey, and it uses storytelling and fairy tales to do that. I was drawn to this deck because it involves woodlands and fairy tales, and just the artwork was really the artwork by Mary La is simply beautiful, and I just knew when I saw that deck that it was one that I had to have in my collection. And this deck certainly helps you to face your fears of the metaphorical forest, so whatever that dark place for you is, this deck will take you there. But I wouldn't say it was necessarily a shadow deck, because I've had some really positive readings from this deck, but it is certainly not afraid to present you with the monsters that might be lurking in the shadows of your subconscious or your imagination. And when you do the readings with this deck, it definitely makes you feel like you're starring in your very own fairy tale. Not only is the artwork beautiful, but it's really immersive, and there's a lot of hidden detail. And actually the book, in the descriptions, it says the extra things that you might not notice on a first glance. So there are layers and additional meanings to each of the cards. Now, cons, for me this is not an issue, but this deck does not have reversals, and the names of the suits are different. So instead of having cups, pentacles, wands and swords, you have spells, visions, challenges and boons. The other thing that is different with this deck is that the names of the court cards are different. So rather than having page, knight, queen and king, you have child, seeker, weaver and keeper. I actually quite like that because it's really interesting because it gives you a different insight into the energies of the court cards. But again, if you're a particular fan of Rider-Waite Smith or you're new to tarot, you might find it, you might want to delay getting this deck, or you might not appreciate those changes. Okie doke, so next up we have the Star Spinner Tarot, created by the illustrator Trungles, and it's published by Chronicle Book. This is a small, rigid magnetic box, and I quite like the compactness of it. It has a small book with it which has full colours, but they are in black and white. Major arcana, you have bigger pictures, and as we get into the suits, you just have a little picture there and then your description. So I was drawn to this deck, seen a couple of reviews online on YouTube, and it was my partner that encouraged me to get this deck, and I'm glad I did, because it's probably a style that I wouldn't normally go for. It's quite graphic. It sort of reminds me of manga. I know it's not exactly manga, but that sort of very simplistic style, but I'd say the colours are a lot brighter. And again, this is another fairy tale deck, done very differently to the Forest of Enchantment, but it is rooted in fairy tales as well. I would say with this deck, this is a no nonsense reading. The cards don't sugarcoat what you need to hear. It's interesting because when I was looking at the reviews for this deck, another reviewer, I think it was maybe Katie Flowers, I don't think she exists, I don't think her channel is running anymore, but definitely go check her out, because she did loads of reviews and I learned a lot from her. And she said about this deck being quite to the point, and I was still quite new to tarot then, and I didn't really understand how different decks could give you different readings. But when I started working with this deck, I noticed that the vibe and the energy of the readings that I was getting was quite different to the Forest deck that we've just looked at. So whereas the Forest deck, although it shows you your demons, it's done, I'd say it was in a more gentle way, whereas this deck is definitely more to the point. I don't know, what have you found? Do you have decks that talk to you like that? Comment below, I'm really interested. So positives of this deck, which is probably talked about quite a lot, but I'm going to re-mention it, is that this is an all-inclusive deck. It is an LBQT deck, and so with the Lovers card, the artist decided to create cards for people with different sexual orientations. So rather than just heterosexual love, you've got people of different genders and, as I said, different sexual orientation, which I think is brilliant. And it'd be interesting to see if more people do that with their decks. The cards are really they're kind of not too thick, not too thin, and which makes them really easy to shuffle, which I know for a lot of people is an important factor. And the cons for this deck is that some of the cards I found quite difficult to connect with. So whereas some cards you can look at them and you can instantly get the meaning of that card, you have to work a little bit harder with some of the cards in the Star Spinner. Well, I certainly found that, which, I don't know, sometimes a little bit frustrating. And I know tarot's a journey, and I know we shouldn't have things, expect things instantly, and things do take work, but I don't know, sometimes because maybe it's just because I'm quite visual, and so I need the pictures to be talking to me maybe a bit more instantly. But other than that, I really do like this deck. Now we move on to the Oriens Animal Tarot deck, and this is by Ambi-Sun and published by Rockpool. And I will say Rockpool is probably my favourite commercial tarot deck publisher, and I'm going to do a video probably about that, comparing them with other decks, to explain why I love their deck so much. So as you can see, this is a rigid box, and you get a really nice full colour booklet, and it's just beautiful. And I was drawn to this deck. Again, it's an animal deck, so instantly drawn to it, but it was really the artwork that stood out. And actually most of these decks, it's because of the artwork that has drawn me to the decks, and I think probably for most people, but I guess for some people it's maybe the author and what they have to say, but for me it's definitely the visual side of it. This deck, and I think it's because, if I just show you the book here, all of the decks come on this kind of black cosmic-y background, and it's just so different to a lot of the other decks that are out there. And because of that, The readings really do feel quite soulful, so it's almost like, for those of you that are into the law of attraction and sort of working with the universe, it does feel like the universe is reaching out to you, and if you're not quite there, sort of gently guiding you back on track. It's really quite incredible how different the readings are with this deck, and there's a lot of detail in the explanations for each of the cards. And so one of the pros, not only is the artwork beautiful, but Ambi Sun has taken the time to connect the meanings of the cards with the attributes of the animals, and explains how the kind of how that animal behaves can reflect the energy of the card, which is so in depth. It's really, really interesting, and I really love that about this deck. The cons, now I really struggled to find some cons about this deck, and so I'm kind of scratching at straws a little bit with this one. If you are into thicker cards, they do feel a little bit thin. And the only other gripe I have with this deck, they've gone to all this effort to make a beautiful box, and when I got it, I don't know if you can see that, you've got this just bit here going on, and it just kind of really bugged me that why go to all this effort to create something beautiful, and that just let it down for me. But other than that, as I said, it's really nitpicky. That was the only thing that I could find that I didn't like about that deck, because it really is stunning. Okay, so the next deck that I got was this deck by Erin Morgenstern, the author of The Night Circus, and this is the Phantomwise Tarot, published by Charles Potter Publishers, and it's in a nice sturdy rigid box, but kind of with a flip lid so they don't come apart. And you get, I'm going to call it a colour book because the deck is black and white, but actually the colours, the printing is, you might not be able to pick it up on film, but you get the nuances of the sort of the greys and the yellowy greys that are in the original cards. So although it's black and white, it is technically a colour booklet. So I got this deck because, as you may have gathered, I do like circusy things, and weirdly enough, it was years after the Night Circus came out that I finally got round to reading it, and I absolutely loved that book. So when I saw that Erin was bringing out this deck, I knew I had to have it. This deck is, I would say, the readings are quite intuitive from this deck. The images are quite simple, and you know, I quite like the fact that they are simple. And when I first started working with this deck, I thought I was going to struggle to get readings from them because compared to some of the other decks I have, there's not quite as much detail in the images. But actually what I found was, even though they were simple, Erin had put enough information in the images to convey the message of that card, and I found a lot of the readings have been quite spot on with this deck, which I was really surprised by, and was kind of pleased and relieved, because after I got it I was like, oh, I don't know if I made a mistake here, but no, you get quite spot on readings. I quite like this deck. I'd say a pro is that it is an extension of that Night Circus world, and in the booklet it says how Erin Morgenstern, because there's a tarot reader in the book, she painted these while she was writing the book to remind herself of tarot and to help with that character. And yeah, it's the first card, I know, is Alice going down the rabbit hole, and this deck certainly takes you into this sort of magical, whimsical world. The cons for this deck for me is that, I don't know if you can see that, I don't know if I can zoom in, but the cards, it's just this weird texture. It's like they've printed it on canvas, which makes the cards really nice and sturdy, but just a bit grippy to shuffle, and the edges are a little bit scuffed, I think, because of it. It's not a major thing, but yeah, I don't know why they did that. So, you know, yeah. Not a fan of the textured cards. So after Phantomwise, and I should say actually, whilst getting these tarot decks, I've got quite a few of Oracle decks. You can probably see them in the back there, sort of in between, but I'm going to do a separate video on Oracle decks. So the next tarot deck that I got is the Enchanted Forhaxa Tarot by MJ Cullinane. This is a Hay House publication. Comes in a rigid box, and you get a quite thick booklet with a couple of black and white pictures in there. I think when you get to a new suit, you get the picture. So I wanted this deck because I love MJ's work. My mum decided that she loves crows, and so she saw that I was getting into tarot, so she got the Crow Tarot, and then I have got the Urban Crow Oracle. I saw this on Instagram posted by MJ, and I just fell in love with it straight away. It's another fairy tale deck, and it's also an elemental deck. So rather than having cups, you have water. Rather than having wands, you have fire. Rather than having pentacles, you have earth. Rather than having swords, you have air. In terms of reading, so like the forest deck, you are transported into this whimsical fairy tale world. And the readings are like a cautionary tale. And so if you're off track, the cards kind of warning you that you're off track, and the dangers, and sort of guide you back to the path that you need to be on. Pros for me is simply the artwork. The level of detail, if I show you the lid of the box here, is absolutely stunning, and I feel that a lot of work has gone into this deck, and MJ Cullinane has put a lot of intention behind every little aspect, every visual aspect that has gone into these cards, and it's just astonishing. Again, as with the Oriens, I've really struggled to find a con with this deck, so it's nitpicking again. Now, I've got quite small hands, and MJ also does a lot of Oracle decks, and this tarot deck is actually Oracle deck sized, so much wider. And obviously Oracle decks are typically, I know, 50-ish is probably about the most you'd get. Obviously with the 78 cards, that's quite a lot of big cards to hold. So for me, this size of card for this quantity of card is quite hard for me to shuffle. However, I understand why she's gone with this size, because the artwork needs to be on a bigger card. I don't think these images would have worked on a tarot sized card. So yeah, it's just practicality on that one for me. So after my 6th deck, I finally decided that it was time to get the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot deck. So this is an iconic deck that I think a lot of people are drawn to. This is the Universal Waite edition, which has been recoloured, and this is a US Games version, and it comes in this nice little tin. It's also a mini deck, you can see, much smaller than some of the other decks. Comes with a very simple little white book. I didn't get this deck initially because, to be honest, I wasn't that keen on the artwork, but after buying this book, The Ultimate Guide to Tarot by Liz Dean, there's a lot of detail in that book, and I'll probably do a review on that book, which made me realise that it was probably time to get this deck into my collection. I haven't really done enough readings to get a general feel of this deck. The few readings that I've done, however, make me suspect that this is going to be a no-nonsense deck, and it's going to be a matter-of-fact deck and with no BS, and it's probably going to call me out on the things that I need to pay attention to or the things that I'm not doing, which is fine because you need those decks from time to time to sort of give you a bit of a kick up the bum. The pros about this particular deck, as I said, it's a mini deck, and skip back to my review on the Forhaxa deck. This is the ultimate extreme. It's like little and large, so these are a lot easier for me to shuffle and to work with in general. The only con I can really find with this deck is the little white book. There's a really nice introduction from Stuart Kaplan which gives quite an interesting history of tarot, and it pointed out a few things that I didn't know or I knew and I'd forgotten, so it's quite handy to refer back to. However, the actual descriptions of the card, I'm presuming these were the original descriptions from Waite, and it's really quite old-fashioned, and it's just written in a really strange way which I have found hard to connect with, and so actually what I found myself doing was using the more modern interpretations of these cards from this book, and then the cards made a lot more sense. So yeah, you've got to have this deck, but you might want to find a more modern interpretation. I think there's other books out there as well, just to help you to decode what the cards are actually telling you. And finally, the most recent deck that I acquired is the Hush Tarot by Jeremy Hush. This has also been published by US Games. It comes in a rigid box and it has quite a sturdy little book. This doesn't have any pictures of the cards in there, and there are reasonable descriptions but fairly limited at the same time, enough to get you going. So I have been looking at this deck ever since I got into tarot. It's been on my wish list for ages, and I was always in two minds about getting this deck. The reason I wanted it was because so this has also got a lot of animals and nature, but it's kind of the darker side of nature, the bits that we want to sweep under the carpet. It's quite macabre, it's quite creepy. I quite like creepy, macabre things. And this is classed as a shadow deck, and perhaps somewhere in my subconscious I was aware that maybe I needed to have a shadow deck in my collection, whilst the forest deck, as I said, has sort of shadowiness to it. I think this deck probably takes it to a new level. However, the readings that I have done with this deck have been peculiar, to say the least, and something doesn't quite fit together. And out of interest, I went on and read some reviews, I think it was on Amazon, of what people had said about this deck, and a lot of people are saying the same things, and I would probably agree with them. Is that although this is meant to be a Rider-Waite-Smith inspired deck, the images and the meanings don't quite match up, and certainly the images chosen to represent certain cards, and if you know your tarot, you would know what I mean by this. And when I do my full review on this deck, I will give some examples, but yeah, they just don't line up, and it got a lot of negative reviews for that reason. However, when I do my readings, I always do an intuitive reading based on the visuals of the cards, and I found that I got more insight from these cards by doing it that way. When I use this deck in the future, I will use it as an intuitive deck, because it just seemed to make more sense to me, and I think that's the only way that I can use it. So the pros of this deck probably is the sort of interesting artwork, and it does have this sort of art from another era feel, and in the little book it does say that Jeremy Hunt was inspired by sort of Victorian art, and it definitely does have that. If you think the Victorians were, it was quite a dark period, and you know, taxidermy and all the, you know, just the streets and the whole vibe was quite dark. It definitely has that dark vibe, and if you're kind of into shadowy things, that might be something that appeals to you. The other con is, and somebody else mentioned this, is that there's something about the quality of the images, like they're not quite sharp enough, which is a shame, because there's obviously a lot of detail has gone into these, and I don't know whether it was lost in when it was because I think these are paintings that have been turned into printed images, and I don't know whether the resolution wasn't quite good enough, or it was cheaply printed. Thank you so much for joining me today to look at my tarot card, my tarot deck collection. I hope you found that useful and interesting, and maybe it has inspired you to get a deck that maybe you've had your eye on but you weren't sure about it. I did promise at the beginning of the video that I would tell you which one my favourite is, so we will do that now. I thought it was going to be difficult, but actually it has to be this deck by MJ Cullinane, the Enchanted Forhaxa Tarot, and it is simply because of the sheer beauty and the level of detail in the artwork. I'm absolutely blown away by this, and what I quite like is I can tell that she has referenced other pieces of art, people like Gustav Klimt, and I will do a more in-depth review on this deck and how I've connected it to other pieces of artwork. And as I said when I was speaking about the deck, is the intention that has gone into this. You can tell this has come from a place of love, and it's just stunning, and I'm really looking forward to working with this deck a bit more as well. But what do you think? Do you use any of these decks that I've shared today? How do you find them? Do you agree with some of my analysis of these decks, or maybe you've had a different experience with them? I'd love to know, so please drop a few comments below. So that is it for today's review. As I said, at some stage I will go through my Oracle deck collection. I have quite a few more Oracle decks, so I might split that into 2 separate videos, otherwise that's going to be a super long video. Also coming up will be updates on my own tarot deck design that I have been working on. But until next time, happy tarot reading, and I will see you soon. Bye bye. What's pronounced? Low Scarabeo, I think that's how that's pronounced. So this is a small rigid magnetic oh man.